Hello. Welcome to the, I'm assuming people can hear me. Saul, can you at least nod? Yes, thanks, Saul. Welcome to the latest roundtable online. Thank you for joining us here. And I don't introduce people. Saul will introduce himself in a minute and explain what he's going to be focusing on. But I just need to do a couple of bits of housekeeping. Firstly, we've been really conservative about bandwidth and trying to make sure that we don't crash the internet or whatever. But so that's why everyone is muted and their videos are off. But I think it's more engaging and more interesting if people can can jump in and ask questions rather than just asking through the chat. I mean, if you have an unstable connection, sometimes you want to ask through the chat, and if you can ask, if you put MQ or KM or whatever, MQ or KM, or can I ask a question, either Mauricio or myself can jump in and ask Saul the question for you. But if you're feeling that your internet's stable, then just jump in and ask the question, because one of the things about the roundtable is that it should be a space for discussion and engagement, and not just a sort of presentation and passive kind of consumption. So please do join in. There is plenty of time at the end. So we used to run an hour and a half. We still run an hour and a half, but we make sure that the person speaking doesn't speak for more than an hour, and then that gives us a good half an hour for discussion at the end. But you can join in at any time, okay? The other thing I need to let you know is that in 2 weeks, myself and Jürgen Doran will be hopefully unveiling a generic translation device for Semantic Gravity and English Discourse. So we'll be doing that in 2 weeks' time. And lastly, that we, having made the roundtable online, having moved it to a time that enables people from around the world to engage, we are now looking to further descend to the center, as it were, and get some of you to lead a roundtable. And we've put that advert out on the LCT email forum and on our socials, Facebook and Twitter. So please do get in touch with us. I think some people are under the impression that it has to be kind of completed or finished or perfect or polished or whatever sort of product. It isn't. We've usually done, this semester has happened to be a number of completed PhDs who do have polished and finished products, but we have a long history of work in progress, a long history of rough and ready ideas for discussion and for people's engagement, and people using the community for ideas and discussion. So don't think you have to have finished or have gone a long way, or maybe there's two of you doing different projects and you can share that time. Just get in touch with the LCT Center or with myself, because if you don't, we won't have the LCT Roundtable online next semester, which our semesters run from August to late November, early December. Okay, with no further ado, unless there's anything that I'm looking at the chat. Mauricio, is there anything else that I need to cover? Any other practical, technical things?
Nope, that's it.
Excellent, great. So without any further ceremony, I shall hand over for the rest of this time to Saul Richardson, who's coming live from in front of a blank wall. Okay, over to you, Saul.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Yes, my name is Saul Richardson, and for the past, I've just finished a PhD looking at jazz education, study of jazz pedagogy, working with Carl at the University of Sydney. I'm also a jazz musician. I play guitar and bass, and I'm the principal and the owner of a jazz school based in Sydney, which is called the Jazz Workshop. Let me do this. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking, and thank heavens that it doesn't have to be a perfect product, because that's something I still aspire to. That's a long way off. Today I'm talking about a problem that one of the problems that I came across during my study of jazz education, which is the issue of mystification in the field. And I'm going to be talking today about, going to be introducing several concepts. I'm going to be talking about I'm going to introduce the idea of a public face and a private face in jazz education. I'm going to be distinguishing between fields of performance and pedagogy in the arena, the social arena of jazz. And I'm going to be talking about concepts from LCT, specialization codes, and also semantic gravity and semantic density. I'm going to talk about how I've used those in my study to look at data, particularly teaching practices of some Australian jazz educators. And then I'm going to use the same concepts and adapt some translation devices, or try to use some translation devices and some concepts some insights that have arisen from those for looking at ways of improving teaching practice. And I'll talk about some ways that if I get time, I've addressed my own teaching practice. As I often do, I'm going to start with a video that's going to set up the issue for us.
You talk about Louis Armstrong, well, you're talking about the deepest human feeling and the highest level of musical sophistication. So that's a rare occurrence in the history of music. He was chosen to bring the feeling and the message and the identity of jazz to everybody. He brought it to all the musicians. He brought it all over the world. He's the embodiment of jazz music.
I still believe that God sent him to this earth to be a special messenger, to make people happy.
The first time he touched the trumpet, he sounded great. I'm sure of that. He just was one of those people who had the spirit was in him. And that understanding that comes from the creator of humanity, he had that.
He knew he was good, you know. He did know that. He said, what I have is God-given.
So there we have a few people talking about one of the biggest stars of the world of jazz, Louis Armstrong. And it's a nice illustration of what I mean, part of what I mean by mystification. The greatness of Louis Armstrong, his ability, his capacity to play jazz was based in who he was, the gift from God. He was the embodiment of jazz music. I'm going to get back to the public face of jazz and mystification in just a moment, but first it's really important to be able to actually see education and see pedagogy in the field of jazz. This is one of the issues that I uncovered in my own study. The way that jazz is spoken about, the way that jazz is taught, is often blind to pedagogy. The journey from a novice to an expert player is seen as a straight line. There's no pedagogy involved. In the example we just saw, Louis Armstrong sounded great the first time he ever touched a trumpet. Of course, he probably wasn't. In fact, he certainly wasn't. But there's no pedagogy in that. It's all about the person and the man's greatness. It's also an issue in studies of jazz education, research into jazz education, which also is often blind to pedagogy. There tends to be a strong focus in research into jazz education into beliefs and opinions, but very comparatively little empirical study of what actually happens in classrooms. So pedagogy can be difficult to see or invisible in jazz in the way that people speak about how it's learned, how it's taught and learned, and also in research into jazz education. So the social arena of jazz is comprised into fields of practice and pedagogy. And one journalist, Nate Sheenan, has described it as two worlds that are separate but symbiotic. And it's a distinction that's key to understanding the contrasts between the reality of jazz education and rhetoric about it in public discourse. Let me explain. Firstly, this is a heuristic diagram of the social arena of part of the social arena of jazz. This illustrates the fields, what I mean by fields of practice and pedagogy, and this is developed from Maiden 2014, which is in turn built on Bernstein. Anyway, fields of practice. The practice field involves mostly performance. Performance can be musicians playing music, can happen in venues, jazz clubs, can be in broadcasts, recordings, composers of jazz. These people occupy the performance aspect of the practice field. There's also academic research, scholarly articles, university jazz studies, which are analogous to maybe Bernstein's field of academic production. Pedagogy involves a recontextualizing field and a reproduction field. In the recontextualizing field, contents, ideas, concepts, important bits of knowledge or practices from the field of jazz performance, the practice field, I should say, are selected, and then they're recontextualized in different ways for educational use. And there's a shift here from the logics of performance to the logics of teaching. What happens in what's good in performance isn't necessarily good for teaching. What's important at a jazz gig isn't necessarily useful for teaching. So the recontextualizing field is where this information, where this knowledge is converted into a form and according to the logics of what's needed for people to learn. Textbooks and methods, educational music, instructional websites, videos, syllabi, individual educators and autodidacts can all be part of the recontextualizing field. And reproduction is where the knowledge is then taught. It's the sites where jazz is taught and learnt: schools, universities, private studios and academies, workshops, jazz camps, community bands, jam sessions, self-directed learning and peer mentoring, and other informal teaching. In my study, jazz education is not limited to formal sites such as like schools and universities. A lot of jazz education research is limited to those places, and reading a lot of jazz education research gives the impression that that's the only place that jazz is taught or learned. But of course, that's certainly not the case, and I'm going to be touching on that as I move on. So I've already shown you a little bit of the public face of jazz, the little introduction video about Louis Armstrong. I know the writing on this is very small. Don't worry about that. This is just an excerpt from a blog post, which is, if you search for self-taught musicians on Google, this blog post will come up as #1 at the moment. That's 15 famous musicians who are totally self-taught. I'm going to Eric Clapton, I don't know if he was self-taught or not. Here we go, Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie is one of the most famous, is a very famous jazz musician, a jazz trumpeter. He's here at number 14 on the blog. There are some other musicians on the jazz musicians on this too, Thelonious Monk and Louis Armstrong, neither of whom were actually self-taught. And they share that in common with Dizzy Gillespie. According to the Joy Tunes blog, he taught himself the trumpet and the trombone by age 12. This is the public face of jazz education. Louis Armstrong, being great at trumpet from the very first moment he picked it up. Louis Armstrong embodying jazz, being possessing the spirit of jazz. The private face of jazz education is quite different from that mythology. For instance, Dizzy Gillespie Dizzy Gillespie's father was a professional musician, and he was exposed to music and musical instruments from a young age, thanks to his father. He had piano lessons as a child. He was taught to read music by his cousin, Norman Powell. He learnt trumpet and trombone at school. He played in a school band, and his band teacher was Alice Wilson, who Gillespie acknowledged as a significant mentor. He participated in the musical life of his elementary school, played in a pit orchestra for plays. Alice Wilson taught him how to interpret popular melodies in a jazz style. It's a form of improvisation. So she taught him. She even taught him as a primary school student, taught him aspects of jazz improvisation. He practiced with his older brother. His older brother took trumpet lessons. They couldn't afford stories. They couldn't afford for both kids to be taught formally by a teacher, but his brother in turn taught his younger brother, Dizzy Gillespie. Eventually went to a high school where he got a scholarship for music. He studied music at Laurenburg Technical Institute, played in the band there under the direction of Shorty Hall. Anyway, he wasn't self-taught. So this is the distinction between the private face of jazz education, which is all about practice and lessons. Dizzy Gillespie's education might be quite familiar to a lot of middle-class Australian students who are learning instruments, playing in bands, taking instrumental lessons, learning at school. Very similar experiences, albeit in a different place and a different era. This is the reality of jazz education. Art Blakey, a well-known jazz drummer, claimed to have no training at all. I'm self-taught. I had no kind of training at all. A natural gift. Apart from the piano lessons he took as a child, played piano at school, drums in his junior high school band, and as an older teen, drum lessons with Chick Webb. He was also mentored by Sid Catlett and Kenny Clark. So again, self-teaching is the mythology. It's the public face, but the private reality of education, the private face, is actually learning, teaching and learning. An Australian saxophonist, Don Burrows. I did 2 years with Eddie Simpson at the Conservatorium on clarinet. That's it. So all he did was study at, all he did was 2 years of tertiary study. You wouldn't say I was the product of any academy. It makes me laugh when I see write-ups to say I was conservatorium trained. I learnt to play in the bandstand. I learnt to play cross-legged in front of the wireless. Another example, pianist Hal Galper. Says here, most of the great masters I had the good fortune to apprentice with did not know theory and played completely by ear. They learned by copying their master, etc. I'm going to move on quickly through this, but needless to say, the great masters he apprenticed with, he studied with them, incidentally, at the Berklee College of Music, and none of these people was self-taught. How do I know this? Well, I was curious. I became part of my study. As part of my study, I became curious about as to whether this is actually, could it be true? Could all the greatest figures in jazz actually be self-taught? So I investigated the biographies of 143 prominent jazz musicians. I picked that number because another researcher, David Ake, looked at about the same number of more recent jazz musicians to deal with the claim that he looked at the same number of recent jazz musicians who were born after 1950 to deal with the claim that that university training somehow gets in the way of success in jazz. So he looked at a large group of musicians who were all university trained. I went back in time. These musicians, 143 of them, go back as far as I think 1870, I think the 1880s is as far as the furthest back they go. Anyway, every musician on this list was formally trained. They took music lessons or they played in school bands. Lots of them studied at university. And this is a who's who of jazz greats, and a few more recent figures, but they're all really important people in the world of jazz, all formally trained. So once again, this is the reality this is the private face of jazz education. It's not as seductive as the mythology of self-teaching and the spirit of jazz, but from the point of view of a teacher and from the point of view of a student and other stakeholders in jazz education, people who actually want to learn how to teach and want to learn how to play jazz, this private face is more useful.
Just to give you a moment's pause, Saul.
Sure.
Just to break it up, I just thought it was interesting to share with you some of the discussion on the chat. And for those who are technically inadept, there's just push the button called chat at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So it's just that some of this is striking a chord in the field, for example, of computer programming. People sort of claiming to be sort of self-taught when they're actually kind of books and BBC programs and magazines, so on and so on. I mean, that's not to say nobody was, but you know, that the idea that it was some sort of just, you know, you kind of create yourself. And I was also struck by a kind of analogy across to something that I had never seen before through the whole PhD, which is, it suddenly reminded me of the way in which major theoretical figures, like, I have to say, Basil Bernstein, kind of almost pretend that there is absolutely no one that they are shaped by. So if you look through volume 3 and volume 4 of Class Codes of Control, particularly volume 4, you won't find much mention of just how much Bourdieu influenced Basil's work there, and Foucault, and Castells, and Richard Sennett. So there is a tendency, I mean, it's interesting here that this is maybe jazz, but there's kind of obviously analogies across to other places in which people are maybe not perhaps so as comprehensively pretending that you cannot learn and be taught, or you cannot be, you know, shaped by anyone in the past. But we certainly have in sociology anyway a tendency for theorists to sometimes write as if there's no one they're influenced by. So I think it's kind of a broad phenomenon that you may be focused on. Anyway, I'll let you carry on.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Yeah, important. Okay, so to begin to unpack this public face, private face LCT, there are some, the concept of specialization codes is useful. It's what I used to look at this. I'm going to very, very quickly go through this. I'll assume that most people watching this are familiar with specialization codes, but in case there are some, it's worth glossing anyway. So specialization codes is an aspect of, it's one of the concepts from LCT. We look at, we distinguish in practices. It's a way of looking at practices. We look at, you can distinguish between epistemic relations between practices and their object, and social relations between practices and their subject. What things are being talked about, or who is talking about them, what's being done, epistemic relations, who's doing it, social relations. These things can be emphasized in different ways as the basis of, one of the bases of legitimation in practices. And we can look at, these can generate varying strengths of epistemic relations, and social relations can generate different specialization codes, knowledge codes. The ones that are going to be most relevant to this discussion today, knowledge codes, where epistemic relations are stronger, where possession of specialized knowledge, principles, or procedures concerning specific objects of studies is emphasized as the basis of achievement. But who's doing what? Who's doing it? People and their feelings and their attributes are downplayed. In NOAA codes, it's the other way around. What's being done, what someone knows is less important than who knows, who's doing it. And in the discussion of the public face of jazz, the strong emphasis, for instance, if you think back to that video at the beginning, the strong emphasis there is on the person, was on Louis Armstrong as a person, not what he could do, but the fact that it was him doing it. That was what really mattered. And his gift, his special gift and his embodiment was the person who was the embodiment of jazz. It wasn't the collection of techniques and concepts. There can also be elite codes where both things are important. Epistemic relations and social relations matter. And they can be mapped on the specialization plane. There's an infinite number of possible strengths of epistemic relations and social relations possible. Part of my study, I looked at a corpus of literature about jazz education. This is how I looked at the public face through public discourse about jazz education. Here are some of the themes that emerge. This is the rhetoric of the public face. Jazz cannot be taught. Great players were all self-taught. Graduates of formal jazz education all sound identical. Formal education is ineffective in jazz. Technique is not relevant, or it's relatively unimportant in jazz playing. Theory represents an attempt to codify jazz or impose a way of playing. Jazz musicians learn to play in the bandstand. Teaching traditional Western education is repressive and theoretical. Knowledge-focused jazz educators teach exclusively from books and only what's in the book, and so on. These things all emphasize social relations and downplay the relative importance of techniques or concepts. So who does things and how they know is more important in this rhetoric than what's done and how it's done. So public face of jazz education emphasizes personal qualities of musicians. It obscures training and expertise. It foregrounds social categories and interactions. And it conflates field of practice and practice and pedagogy. I think the examples I've given have covered most of these. The conflation of practice and pedagogy is a really important one. It's quite common to find discussions of jazz, people criticizing what the things that students do when they're learning as inauthentic. That's not jazz, it doesn't sound right. But that kind of thinking is an example of conflating practice and pedagogy. It's assessing, it's judging, it's evaluating what happens in the classroom according to the logics of performance. But as I said before, what is good on the bandstand at a gig isn't necessarily helpful in a classroom. So education operates according to educational logics, pedagogic logics, not performance logics. And this is a problem. And I'm going to move on to talking about some jazz educators now. It's a problem because it makes it difficult for stakeholders to know what they're supposed to do. Stakeholders are students and teachers in particular. If you want to learn, if you want to be able to play jazz, what do you do? How on earth do you go about learning it? How do you do it? And if you want to teach someone how to do it, how on earth do you do that? If I'm not born as Louis Armstrong or some other jazz great, am I doomed to failure? Can I even learn jazz? Of course, the private face of jazz, the biographies of the musician show that yes, you can. And that's useful for us as teachers. So public face is a Noah code. I'm going to go quickly through this is a translation device for specialization, specialization in my data. In discourse, I'm going to move on. I think it's more important for teaching to actually move on to a second translation device. But I'll get to that later on. But in my data, stronger epistemic relations was manifested in emphasis on learning the right techniques or procedures, such as playing correctly, jazz being teachable, stressing the importance of putting importance on formal instruction, and weaker epistemic relations, self-expression, approximation, personal styles, as opposed to rules, having a go. And there are some quotes here, for instance, I think you can be good at jazz and not be even that good of a player. One of the teachers I interviewed for my study, a teacher called Julian, not his real name, thought that. So it downplays techniques and emphasizes the person. And stronger social relations, emphasizing born or social attributes such as talent or race, self-teaching, self-actualization. Jazz is already in this. My playing comes from the heart, not from technique or anything, and that's jazz. Said by a young pianist, Joey Alexander. You have to have a feeling for it. I don't think jazz can be taught. Quote from Betty Carter. Part of that's missing. So weaker social relations. I need to move on. The other concept that I'm going to talk about is semantic gravity and semantic density. Semantic gravity is context dependence and semantic density is complexity in practices. They can be brought together with specialization codes to analytically distinguish epistemic semantic gravity and epistemic semantic density of objects, formal definitions, specialist knowledge, and empirical descriptions. and also axiological semantic gravity and axiological semantic density of values or emotions. So looking at context dependence and complexity of practices and of feelings, of people, of discourse, of dispositions, and so on. The concepts are essentially the same. They're just looking. It just depends which one of those things they're looking at. In my data, when I was looking at discourse, emphasis, a weaker semantic gravity, so less context dependent, is talking about teaching. That looks at a principle or a technique or a concept, something that's transferable to multiple contexts. And in the axiological form, it's a feeling or a disposition or a value that's applicable to multiple concepts. So an example of weaker epistemic semantic gravity, there'll always be one note that works. Find that note, boom, and then try some other notes. In salsa music, everything is built around the clave. So these are general principles that reach out from the moment in the classroom when those things were said to other contexts, and learn the melody, listen to the originals, all of the fundamental things you actually I'm only just preaching to the choir here. That's an axiological value. The disposition of familiarity with the canon of jazz. It's a general principle. Look outside, points out the window. What's the feature of what you see at the moment? This is stronger epistemic semantic gravity. Pick a note. You're just going to tootle around on that note. These things are limited to the moment. They're highly context dependent. They're locked into the moment in the lessons when those things were said by a teacher. How many people recognize this song? It's very safe in here. Play that note with so much love and passion. I can't stand it. This is strong. These are examples of stronger axiological semantic gravity. And remember, semantic density is complexity. So more complex concepts and techniques.
So can I just jump in for a second?
Sure.
I just wanted to say for anybody who's relatively new to the idea of there being different kinds of semantic gravity and semantic density, the epistemic semantic density and semantic gravity and the axiological are simply the kinds of meanings that are being talked about. So if they are kind of objects of study or skills and techniques and procedures, the epistemic stuff, that's the epistemic semantic density, epistemic semantic gravity. So context dependence of meanings that are that kind. And if they're axiological, they're more kind of knowery stuff. I just wanted a bit of a gloss there for anyone who's not come across that use of specialization alongside semantics.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's not as complicated as it might sound. That's all I'm saying. It's just the kind
No.
of meanings that are being related to a context or being more or less complex.
Yep. Okay, so speeding through this complexity. I'm going to move. If anyone wants this, you can. Well, it's in the thesis, or you can ask. I can send it to you later. But there are different forms of complexity, of relative complexity as well, in the epistemic and axiological forms. So let's look at how this works in some of my data. One of the teachers, who I have called Drew, talking about jazz. Once you've felt it, Duke's thing. If you don't know, no one can tell you. If you've played and you felt that, then you know that's what you always look for. And that was really what I wanted the ensembles to experience. I should mention these were after my study of the corpus of literature, public discourse. I did case studies of jazz educators who were teaching at a summer jazz camp for teenagers and musicians aged 10 to about 19. It was held in Sydney. And I interviewed each one of them and I watched them teaching. I videoed them teaching 4 90-minute lessons each and analysed those lessons. That's really so this is what Drew said, that was really what I wanted the ensembles to experience, something unforgettable. I have 4 days, I have a fixed amount of time in that class for those musicians to experience something. This was, for this teacher, this was his main aim in teaching. This is stronger social relations, feelings. He wanted them to feel something. It wasn't at all about techniques or how to do anything, how to play anything specific, not jazz theory, but feelings. Here's an example. It's a short video of Drew teaching, and this is an excerpt, but essentially this is the whole lesson. I'll stop that there. It's the rest of it is essentially the same. This is free, non-idiomatic improvisation. The teacher, Drew, is directing the action. He's scaffolding the experience for them, but this is an example of him creating an experience for the students that will help them feel something. He wants them to get the feeling of jazz through this lesson. This activity went on for close to half an hour. There was there was very little discussion at the beginning. He looked at them. He said to the students, "Look out the window and play what you see." And it was a rainy day, so they were responding musically to that, albeit scaffolded by the teacher. Then once they'd finished, this is really most of the discussion that happened. Free playing takes an incredible amount of maturity to do well, Drew said, but it's an experience that you have to have. It's a bit of a scary thing because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to create. He was strongly focused on the feelings, not on techniques. Then he asked the students what they thought the value of the exercise might be, and someone said something about making you more mature. It's a good way to pass on emotion. You can get away from the chords, just any extroversion. You don't really need to worry. You can just let it out and have a play. I don't know how to explain it. And then Drew said, yeah, it's pure emotion, isn't it? Because you're not thinking anything outside. And then you're pushing your improvising. You practice while you're improvising, and this pushes you to go beyond your comfort. So this is an example of a lesson teaching for feelings, not for knowledge. The students haven't learned anything about, in a technical sense, how to play jazz, but they've felt something. Another teacher, and that's an example of a teacher who, when he was interviewed, I'm still talking about Drew, espoused a Noah code, and he taught very much in a Noah code. Another teacher, Julian, also espoused a Noah code. He understood jazz as a Noah code and jazz education in terms of a Noah code. I'm going to talk about how he taught improvisation, and I'm going to contrast that with how he taught reading notated music. When Julian taught improvisation, concepts remained simpler, tended to be atomistic series of unrelated or loosely related activities that tended not to build knowledge cumulatively. The lessons, the students had to play at a concert at the end of the week. They had to play for 20 minutes. Julian prepared his class to play a class of young beginners. They were aged about 11 and 12 mostly. They had to play for 20 minutes at the end of the week at a short concert. And the lessons were entirely focused on preparing the students to play those three tunes. Virtually everything they did was really strongly locked into those three tunes. When he taught improvisation, he taught in ways, he gave them just enough information to get through the gig. So he would say things like, use these three notes, make something up using these three notes in this tune, or for an improvised solo. Nothing useful for other contexts. That's not transferable knowledge. It's locked right into the context. But in contrast, when he taught about ways of knowing and how to be the right kind of person to know jazz and to listen to jazz and to experience and play jazz, that teaching was sustained and built cumulatively over the lessons, and it reached out to general principles. So here's an example of Julian talking about improvisation. We're going to take it back to the very beginning element. We're just going to pick one note, whatever note comes to mind. It could be one of the notes out of the melody, because we know the melody note will work. Context dependent. Just gently play that note, and you're going to tootle around on the note. And that was pretty much the extent of the teaching, just tootle around with that note. This developed into lesson 2, and the second lesson out of his 4. They expanded from whatever that one note was to 3 notes. So what we're going to do is we're doing 3 notes, add a note on top of what you're doing or on bottom, and just explore the other notes. Try some different notes. You can try flattening or sharpening a note. Just try to find some notes that work. There are no rules now, no rules. We're just having a play. There's nothing that's really transferable to other contexts. He doesn't talk here about how those notes might relate to the piece they're playing or to the genre or the style. There's nothing about that. It's entirely locked into getting through, playing something that works in that tune, in that rehearsal, and then that they can also do to get through the concert at the end of the week. And then right at the end, he downplays epistemic relations. No rules right now, no rules. We're just having a play. By contrast, when he taught about, in his second lesson, he taught about how to look at he was talking about reading some notated music off a lead sheet. It was a 12-bar blues. Here's an example of him teaching the students about how to read, really about how to follow the music. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You've got 12 bars that repeat. So that's our 12-bar song. Typically, what we do in jazz is we play a short song and we repeat the form. This is mapped out here on this is a semantic profile showing how the concepts change over time. Starts very, very simply and very context dependent. You're literally counting the bars. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pointing at the sheet as he does so. You've got 12 bars that repeat. And then he talks about it becomes a little bit less context dependent. You've got 12 bars repeat. He's reaching out to, well, there might be other tunes that have a 12-bar structure as well. And then typically, here's a more general principle. Typically what we do in jazz is we play a short song and we repeat the form. So he's moved out to principles now, and then he comes back down to the concrete present. In this case, it's a 12-bar blues form. We repeat 4 solos. If it's a short song, here's another principle. If it's a short song, we play the song twice. So that could be taken from this performance to other performances in other in other situations. We play the song twice. We do the solos. We play the song twice at the end. So he taught very different. He taught quite differently when he was talking about notated aspects of the music. But when he was talking about improvisation, which he explained when I interviewed him, he sees as it is something personal. It's derived from it's self-expression. It's not just manipulation of musical elements or deploying different techniques. He taught differently, atomistic, concrete, context dependence, and relatively simple when he was talking about improvisation. When he was talking about features, just how to read music, he moved into more of a knowledge code, and he reached out to principles, gave transferable knowledge. Here is Julian talking about explicitly teaching how to be a knower, essentially. And he's teaching it through his body language at the moment. He's modeling for the students how you're supposed to listen to jazz.
But I'm a stickler for 100% participation.
Good to see, Saul, that they're all already prepared for a pandemic with those lovely bubbles over their heads.
Ah, well, yes. Thanks, Carl. Where was I? I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is a transcript of what he talked about immediately following that video. He expressed disappointment that the students didn't seem to be sufficiently into it. They weren't listening in the right way or feeling the right way. And then he moved into an analogy. It's like a religious experience. That's how listening to jazz should be. Yes, sir. It's like a preacher giving a sermon. And here's an axiological semantic profile of what went on in this sort of vignette of teaching. He identified the problem. So this is what's happening in the you and me, the here and now. It's simple, and this is the immediate context. Then he moved out to a general principle. You need to be into it. You've got to really feel jazz when you're listening to it. Then he brought it back down to a concrete, context dependent. Talked about his own personal feelings at the moment, and then likens listening to jazz to the feeling of religious worship, and then back down to how he feels at jazz concerts. So it's still out there. That's not the immediate concrete present, but it's a little bit more context dependent because he's talking about himself, not just how everybody should feel in general when they're feeling to jazz. And then he brought it down at the end. He gave the students some specific things that he'd like them to listen to. Listen to the bass, listen to the drums. And then he played the recording of Work Song. That was the tune that they were listening to. He played it again. So this is a semantic wave. A semantic wave is associated with, tends to be associated with knowledge building, moving students between the concrete present, between context, the immediate context, and other situations. So giving them, unpacking what they're learning and what they're doing into a form that will be transferable and useful in other situations. He does this with feelings, but he did not do it with techniques for playing jazz. So the problem with that is that it has the potential to it might constrain students' potential, or problematizes students' potential to learn how to play. On the other hand, it facilitates their potential to know how to feel and how to respond to jazz. So maybe useful for becoming an audience for jazz, an audience member, but less practically useful for actually knowing what to play or how to play. If your view of jazz, if your understanding of what jazz is that it's all self-expression, and if you're born with it, and if you're not born, then you can do it, and if you're not born with it, then you can't do it. If you're the wrong kind of person, you can't do it, then that's fine. However, as my look at my examination of the public, my contrast of the public and private face suggests, actually, that's not really the reality. So we need to cut through that rhetoric and that mythologizing to actually help people learn stuff. So how can LCT help us teach for more effective knowledge building? I have a feeling I'm going to run out of time, but I'm going to talk about I'm going to touch on another translation device that I developed for understanding the practices of jazz musicians. And this is useful. Firstly, by the way, actually, no, I'll move on. It's useful to look at jazz in terms of practices and what happens when people play jazz is in some ways similar to what happens when people play sports, for instance, soccer or football. We know the field, we know the kinds of things that are going to happen. We might even know the starting positions and the roles of different players. But actually how each match, and in the case of jazz, how each performance pans out, we can't really say beforehand. We know the kinds of things that are going to happen, but what each person does, what happens as it unfolds, depends on where all the other people are and where the ball's going, what's going on, and what time it is. It's not choreographed. So the first key to teaching about jazz is teaching about responsive interaction in the ensemble. Just like on the soccer field, what each person does, what our saxophonist does as they play, depends on what the other members of the band are doing. And what each one of those other people does depends on what each of the others is doing. It unfolds in a very similar way, although with less diving. So, and
you wouldn't have heard that, but I laughed out loud then, Saul, and maybe some other people did too.
Thank you. So this is, I've called this semantic gravity, so this is just a more formalized heuristic of that diagram I just showed you. When people are playing music, let's pretend we just have two people instead of a whole band. Both participants, both performers could be improvising at the same time. What person one does depends on what person two does, and vice versa. Or one person could be improvising and responding to the other, but it's just a one-way interaction. An example of that might be also someone improvising with a pre-recorded backing track. It's not responsive improvisation. And then you could have two people sitting side by side reading off notation. Neither of them is responding in the same way to the others. It'll be very similar, if not the same, each time they perform that piece. Most jazz musicians, when they perform, tend to move through this scale. The top of the scale, responsive, two-way responsive interaction, I'm calling stronger. I've called stronger semantic gravity, because what happens depends in that moment depends on what's going on in that moment. Whereas two people reading off a notated score will do much the same thing wherever and whenever they play it. Two people playing the piece in Sydney will do much the same thing as two people playing the same piece in Berlin. But jazz performances tend to move around these different levels, these different strengths and weaknesses of semantic gravity. But improvisation, I'm going to skip through this. This is what I just said. No, it's not. It is. I need to go through it. The other thing we have in jazz, as well as interaction, we have semantic density. The improvisation can be idiomatic, in a particular recognizable as a style, or non-idiomatic. The example of Drew's students playing The Storm, looking out the window, was non-idiomatic. They weren't trying to sound like any particular recognized style of jazz. The recordings of Louis Armstrong that you heard at the beginning were idiomatic. They were in a traditional jazz or a swing jazz style. And another useful translation device that can be enacted in teaching is this. Looking at semantic gravity in jazz improvisation in terms of variation, reading off notation, exact reproduction of a composition, stronger semantic gravity. So this is a different form of semantic gravity, but still semantic gravity. You can, when you play a melody, you can decorate the melody. It doesn't sound, so it sounds recognizable as the original piece that you started with, but it sounds like it's been jazzed up a little bit. Most conventional jazz improvisation is based on the underlying harmony of a piece of music, of a tune, but the original melody is absent. Another musician listening might be able to recognize the chords, but the melody isn't the original anymore. And free improvisation without any apparent link to an original source is the strongest semantic gravity, and it's strongest because it depends on what the performers do in the you and me, the here and now. Moving quickly through this semantic, this is an example of how semantic density can be built in music. There's a musical fragment. There it is. Here it is in a context. It has more meaning. It's related to something else by being in that context. Here it is somewhere else, means it reaches out to something else there, but it has more meaning. Meaning's not really the right word, but it condenses something more than just the fragment on its own. Here's a piece of jazz. That little fragment, played by Clifford Brown, involves a well-known pattern, a fragment of music called the Bebop Lick. Here's a technique that's common in bebop style jazz improvisation. Part of an aspect of building up. That's one of the things that bebop style musicians do to make it what they play sound like the bebop style, descending bebop 7 scale, an ascending dominant 7 arpeggio in thirds. So this is, I'm talking about semantic density here. Clifford Brown deployed idiomatic elements of bebop in his playing, and by doing that related what he played out to things beyond his immediate context, to the genre of the style of bebop. Stronger semantic density, weaker semantic density, non-idiomatic, improvising, like what Drew's students were doing when they played the rain. I think I'll move through this. You can see on the slides, though, there's another fragment of music, and it just shows all of the things that are condensed into this tiny fragment that make that fragment sound like the bebop style, and that in turn axiologically reaches out to people and styles and ways of being and hipness and so on. So each one of those fragments means little, relatively little on their own, but when they're put together into a context, they gain meaning. I'm going to skip through this. Here's an example of we're not going to play the whole thing, a student band. This is a student jazz band. So there's a student jazz band playing Autumn Leaves, a jazz standard tune. And how can we can use those translation devices, you can act those concepts that I was just talking about in pedagogy to help those students move from that, which resembles jazz, but it's a pedagogic version of jazz. How do they get from that to this? And I should apologize, the scale seems to be missing from the left-hand side of this semantic profile. It's semantic gravity, stronger semantic gravity at the top. Sorry, stronger semantic gravity at the bottom, weaker semantic gravity at the top. The piano player is playing an idiomatic version, using slight embellishment, of the tune Autumn Leaves, same tune as those kids were playing. Now improvising. It's based on the underlying harmony, but the original melody is absent. And here is a saxophonist, John Coltrane, improvising. Anyway, it goes on like that. He moves a long way away from the original theme, and then only touches or hints at it right at the end of his performance. So in this performance of Autumn Leaves, semantic gravity is one of the keys to making it sound the way that it does. It can vary over the course of an improvisation or a performance, just like this one in the example here. So these students here could be helped through, I'm going to go all the way back to this. All right, it's further back than I thought. I can't find it. Anyway, there was a picture there was a picture of me teaching some students with a semantic profile on the board. And this is exactly the kind of thing that that lesson was about. It was about how to, I was talking about this. I wasn't using the term semantic gravity, but in all other respects, I was talking about I was using this language along the left-hand side, and using exactly the same concepts to help those students understand the different degrees of improvisation, the ways that semantic gravity can be varied over the course of their improvisations, and how to helping them get from this very context independent. Okay, this is very weak semantic gravity here. How to get them from that to the stronger semantic gravity of what John Coltrane is doing here. Why is it stronger semantic? Why is it stronger semantic gravity? It's because what's being played depends on what the other musicians are doing in that moment. It's locked into the here and now. But if we take the original theme as, on the other hand, as the exact reproduction of a composition, can escape that gravity. Okay, so there are different forms of semantic gravity. These concepts can all be taught, and the semantic wave profile, the semantic profile, gives a visual representation that's quite powerful, and as I've found really effective in my own teaching. I got a feeling I'm out of time.
So I was going to ask you a question and also point out, like, sort of I want to be wrapping up, which is, so you're saying that there's, in terms of the practical use of at least this part of LCT, that you can think of what you do use semantic gravity, even if it's tacitly, in two different ways, which is on the kind of, I don't know what kind of semantic gravity it would be, but the semantic gravity of being in the room face to face, interacting, as opposed to that kind of strong semantic gravity, as opposed to the context independence of reading the score that is always the same in every context. That's one kind. But then there's the other. Right. So they need to come down into the context of fellow jazz players. But on the other hand, they need to free themselves from the text, as it were, from the context of the music, of the score.
Yeah, or learn actually the principle that jazz musicians move between. Sometimes they're in the score, sometimes they're away from it. The students in the example that I gave were locked in. They were locked into it. They weren't moving away from it. Whereas the professionals that I played, it's just like they fly through different degrees, different strengths. Yes, and you're right. There's the context. There's semantic gravity in terms of interaction. What happens here and now depends on what else is happening here and now. And then, so it's two.
I think those two different kinds of semantic gravity may have confused some people.
Okay.
Some people are kind of going, "Oh, that I don't quite follow it." But so I think there's two things that need to be really, just to be clear, is that you've got the relationship to the score.
Yes.
The score as opposed to what you're interacting with, and then you've got. Yeah, so you've got the concept interacting, riffing off with somebody in the room.
Yes.
Is much more context dependent, obviously.
Yes.
As opposed to locking onto a score. But to do real jazz, you also have to, you have to really free yourself from the score as well. So, I mean, it's slightly confusing because it depends on which context you're kind of riffing off in your thing. So I'll just, by the way, want to open it up to anybody. Anybody's got any questions? Oh, can I open it up, Saul? Have you finished, or do you have something you want to just round off with?
Well, I was just going to say that wasn't. I should have pointed out that these the last two translation devices that I talked about weren't really used as part of my thesis. They were abandoned because they looked at what students were doing rather than what teachers were doing. They weren't looking at discourse, which isn't. I was just looking at teacher discourse in my study. Looking at teacher discourse is useful. Thinking about teacher discourse in terms of the concepts is helpful for teachers teaching, looking at our own practice. But then what we're actually doing, these other concepts are useful. I found them really useful for teaching, helping students, if that makes sense. They're less developed than the ones for discourse. They're still a work in progress, I should say. The general takeaway message, or just a really simple conclusion from my study, was that when you're teaching jazz, you shouldn't neglect knowledge, but you shouldn't neglect knowing either. Both of those things are actually important. Who people are, knowing canon, those things are really important in the world of jazz, just as important. But also actually how to play stuff, and all of that formal education by those famous jazz musicians I talked about at the start involved techniques rather than just how to be the right kind of knower. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. There's been so much. Thanks for reminding us of that stuff at the start, because there's been so much. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion chat earlier on about how similar that mystification and mythology has been to other fields,
Yes.
very far away from jazz as well. But I mean, all the way through to thinking about how you can use semantic gravity. And I see what you mean about not being like you were saying, it's not a perfect product, because that late stuff is the stuff that you didn't put in your PhD, as you say. It's stuff that's more kind of practically oriented and work. You're still working with it.
Yes.
What I want to do is open it up to anybody and everybody, so you don't just have to write in chat. And in fact, you never had to. You could just jump in at any point. But has anybody got like any questions or comments or just observations or anything? I mean, this is an online space for discussion, and I can barely speak. I've got sinusitis, so
your audio is also going really weird from my end.
Right, I'm going to go while people jump in and have their own things. I'm going to go to get off my Wi-Fi.
Saul, I got a couple of questions.
Sure.
All right. So just two short things. You mentioned that there was an axiological relation when you referred to the history of jazz, or the tradition of jazz, like when the Charlie Parker, Bebop, and so on, and you coded that as axiological relation.
Yes.
Because that's actually, it spoke to me very well, because I am also having to deal with tradition in the law, in the legal tradition, of my data. So I just wanted to check that, because that sparked a very good idea. And how did you arrive to using, axiological relation to signify that?
Well, I was looking. As I showed, I started with what was in the music. So not axiological or epistemic, but when someone plays that music in that style, if at a performance, if at a gig you play that, you play Charlie Parker licks, you immediately associate yourself with a way of playing and with a school of performers in jazz, and with a style, and you might quote from Charlie Parker in an ironic sense. It's old, it's funny. So that's axiological. That's not it's not epistemic anymore. So that's how I got there. It reaches out to something. Does that help? It reaches out to something else that's not epistemic at all.
That's very interesting. I can see the parallels for my own data. And the other question I got was very simple. How do you think the mystification occurs? Like not how, sorry, why there's this mystification, at least in the field of jazz?
Because it's a Noah code. So people, the view of jazz, or the public face of jazz, is that it's about that the music itself is the expression of something deeply personal. So therefore, being good at jazz is being the right kind of person, having the jazz inside you already. Like the video at the start said, having the spirit, being born with the spirit inside you. So that's why, because of the Noah code.
Okay, thank you, Saul.
Pleasure.
Saul, I have a quick question.
Hi, Steve. Yes.
Hey, Saul. I was interested.
Steve!
Hey, Carl. I've decided to pop up. Saul, I was, you know, this has been a long journey for you, and this has been kind of, incredible work. And I was interested in how it's changed and affected you as a performer and as a teacher.
Yeah. Well, it's given me insight into what people are doing, and how and why, and to escape from the specifics of licks and particular chords and ways of playing, to look at to start to understand what we do in jazz in a more general way. And that's been really useful for teaching as well, because it transcends any particular genre. Or when people talk about jazz, the common red herring is just to be sidetracked into, well, you need to define what jazz is, but that kind of discussion always just gets bogged down in in the empirical. In the surface features of notes and scales and that kind of thing. So it overcomes that, and the idea of teaching, or it's something I aim to do in my teaching of jazz, is to equip people to play not any particular style, but just to to transcend context, to be able to function as improvising jazz musicians, regardless of what context or style they find themselves in.
So do you see a shift in your pedagogy over the course of your doctorate?
I do. I talk to students in terms of essentially what was on those translation devices. In terms of, I talk a lot about interaction, responsive interaction, and I talk a lot about, variation away from the theme and the effects of it, which I didn't before. It was so yeah, it's given me a new way of thinking about it.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Hey, so that's really interesting. I was just thinking in terms of SFL, apologies, I'm not going to go deep into SFL here, but
thank you.
We talk about logogenesis, ontogenesis, and phylogenesis, so the unfolding of the text. And it seems to me that what you've got here, what you're talking about with the semantic gravity, it's a really good way to map all three, because you can map the unfolding in a song, as you had, I think, for your students in a shot with you with the whiteboard with the head and then going off into the solos and coming back down. You can do the same with the ability of someone as they progress. So when they're learning, they're stuck down the bottom, or they're, and they can only push up a little bit and come back down. But as they advance and advance, and you get to Coltrane or Parker or whoever, you go right up. You can also do the same thing with the development of jazz, jazz as a phenomenon across history, where go back to early jazz, it was much more built around the melody, and then as it progressed, it went right away until you got to free jazz, and then some movements bring it back down. So you've got those waves of coming up and down. So it in SFL terms, you can map the logogenesis, ontogenesis, and phylogenesis in the way that you've mapped there. So it seems to me that it's actually an incredibly useful tool that you've developed, and a really useful way of understanding jazz on all three different timescales. So congratulations, it's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
You'd better write some of it up then, Saul, and publish it.
Yep. Sure will.
People, please just jump in. I mean, we are trying to recreate. It's not the same, obviously, using semantic gravity, one of the tools that you brought in at the end. It's harder to riff off each other when you're not in the room. And this is a generalized phenomenon in the pandemic time of, the struggle that is to do stuff on Zoom and to get a jazz thing going. So just jump in when you can. And if you have any, for example, earlier on, people talking about the mystification and the mythology and just how damaging it can be. And I see that in something as strangely different to jazz as project-based units that I'm teaching, in which creativity and collaboration and lots of other words beginning with C, critical thinking, all of these are not taught as explicit skills, but somehow unlocked from within the DNA of the student, by enabling them through some sort of wonderfully supportive environment or activity, and somehow that just unlocks them, like unlocking the spirit of jazz from the DNA of the greats. And so I don't think it's a million miles away, even though jazz is very different from the sort of thing that I'm teaching, or I'm having to teach, I'm forced to teach at the top university, the top university level of undergraduates. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing anything like that, or anything in which pedagogy is sort of like hidden or erased. I'd be interested if people have.
There was a comment before that I would like to remark to Saul, which was how much was body teaching a part of like bodily, movements and, motions and so on, was part of teaching jazz in regards like to Elena's work on ballet, for example.
Body movement, almost no part. Except in that little video that I showed you, the clip of the teacher teaching how you should drive around as you listen to jazz, which wasn't really about body movement more so much as concentrating and focusing and feeling it. He was trying to demonstrate what it looks like to really feel it. Of a body movement, otherwise, no. Not really.
I think Steve actually had a more specific question than that. It's like in Eleanor's study, the teacher would come over and move an arm or a leg or something like that. Do you ever get that sort of thing where a teacher comes over and like says, no, put your fingers here on the fretboard, put your fingers here on the drums or wherever it might be, and actually physically moves them?
Yes, that's common. It's common in my teaching, and I've been taught that. Yes, it is. People, yes.
Yeah, but did you find it in your study of these code teachers?
In my study of no. Actually, yes, I did. Julian, the one, the how to listen guy. He taught the percussionist, he taught the drummers in his band in that way. He would put the right kind of stick in their hand in the right way, and then would move their hand and show them how to hold things. He would do that, not to anyone playing any other instrument, and he was the only. And the other Noah code teacher, Drew, whose students were looking out the window playing the rain, never did anything like that. There was a third teacher who was a knowledge code whose teaching enacted a knowledge code. He was a piano player, and he would go and reach his hands around behind the piano player and show him physically how to play things. So there was some of that, but I don't think it's quite as easy on a guitar or a drums or piano. It's easy. If you're playing a saxophone or a trombone or something like that, it's not such an easy thing to do. They'll sing. They'll demonstrate by singing.
I suppose the key question I should be really asking is whether they then use that as a means of teaching anything beyond the very specific context. I mean, you can take someone's fingers and sort of paste them onto a guitar's fretboard and say strum that, without actually teaching them that that's the chord of C or C minor, and that you need to go there if you're going to do that part of a song, or if you want that sort of effect. And I know in Eleanor's work, it would be you put your hand there, you put your foot there, or you look in that direction, and that is first position or second position, and that becomes a transportable piece of knowledge. Whereas, I mean, I wondered whether in your study with the Noah code teachers, particularly the constructivist types, whether they actually, when they physically moved them, whether they gave them anything like, well, that's how you play bridge, or that's what you do when you're doing X or Y or Z. Or
one of them never did anything. One of them never did anything like that, and then the other one did. Julian, again, only with the drummers, and it's something I haven't really gone into. But he spoke to his drum students in a slightly different way to everybody else. But he would tell them, this is how to play a wirro. This is how to play. This is how to hit the right cymbal. But he didn't make it. There was no more explicit than that, and it's far less formal than this is first position, this is second position. So it happened with one of them, but
one of the things that I remember that struck me about Eleanor's work was the way that she has a very so part of her translation device is about showing how concrete behaviors, like the ballet teacher telling the students not to drink during classes or to stand in a particular way, that there are sort of concrete SG plus behaviors that over time become embodied. So she interpreted one form of SG minus as being about embodied dispositions that then get carried to different contexts. And I wondered whether there was any analogy in jazz. So I remember in your thesis, there's one of your teachers gets his students to sit and gaze out the window and look at the rain and then play what they feel. And I wondered whether there was a sense in which those kinds of behaviors build over time and over context towards a set of embodied dispositions that become feeling and become intuition. But if you analysed it, they would actually be connected to concrete events and concrete behaviours, like gaze out the window, look at the rain and play what you feel.
Yeah, possibly. The gaze out the rain exercise would be over a much longer time scale than the 4 days that teacher had. I think there are things that are similar. For instance, and there are some common themes, like use your ears, not your eyes. Learn by hearing, not by looking or reading. That's a really important one. That's one of the teachers. The teachers had different teaching styles. Some were more explicit than others. So the explicit one, Julian, the Noah, when he taught, the Noah code teacher taught this explicitly. Say, jazz isn't about what you can see, it's about what you can hear. And he kept reminding them to use their ears. And the other teacher, Drew, also the Noah Code teacher, use your ears. What are you hearing? This is good. You're using your ears now. So it's less formal, I think, than what Eleanor sees, but it's the same sort of effect. Canon building as well. You need to know these people, and then you need to know Miles Davis. You need to know Kind of Blue, and then becomes over time just references to specific performances or recordings or musicians, with the assumption that this is just stuff that we know. So in that sense, those things do become embodied, and they are important in jazz. That's part of the experience of being a jazz musician, is knowing who people are and things like that. So to some extent, I'd say yes.
And that sounds like an excellent position. Oh, sorry, there was one more person saying something?
Yes, hi Saul. It's Nick West from South Africa here.
Hello.
I just want to ask a question. I don't know if it's a funny one. I've been thinking about it. So I never thought of it this way in terms of improvisation, of course, being highly contextual to the time, to the feeling, to the everything. Your semantic gravity increases.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just thinking that performance that clip you played in the beginning of Louis Armstrong playing.
Yes.
Now I know that tune very well. I've heard it thousands of times before. So in my mind, one could argue that the improvisation that occurred at that time, it has now become a standard. So now I'm wondering, through the pass of time, what was highly contextual has now become a norm, and in a sense, the gravity has decreased. So it's just an interesting, I don't know if it's an observation or a thought, philosophical question there. So that almost a time-dependent variation of gravity.
Yeah, that's interesting, and a much longer time scale. I think maybe there's a difference between a text, like a recording, which becomes the standard, and an individual performance, an individual musician's performance of a piece at any given time. It would be, in most jazz circles, it would be quite unfashionable to play anything in note for note, rhythm for rhythm, the same way as Louis Armstrong did. So I think even if an Armstrong performance of something became the standard way of playing, that in turn becomes the new starting point, and then improvisations move away, from that, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you.
But it's a really interesting idea.
That was a really great question. A very big picture question too. And I'm sorry to say that I should bring this to a close, because it's now 5:40, and for those who have weekends, the weekend beckons, which makes it so different to the rest of the week, being at home, perhaps not going out. Anyway, pandemic jokes aside, thank you so much, Saul, for that. It's really not at all easy to do a talk to a bunch of names on a screen. But thanks very much for taking us through some of the work that you've done, and I know that's just some of it. And thanks everybody for joining in chat, and for those who asked sort of questions. And we're going to have to figure out more and more how to make this more and more interactive, so that we can get more and more engagement for speakers and feedback and so on. So I'm always open to more ideas on that front. But for now, thanks so much, Saul. And you have to just take me in lieu of an actual, round of applause from people. And thanks for everybody. Well done, John. And thanks for everybody else who are here, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, Saul. Thanks, everybody, and I'll chat to you all soon.
Thanks.
Thanks.